which is where assurances are given, those assurances are ultimately breached, a whole new set of proposals come back. So how can we ensure, and what can the Prime Minister say to my constituents to assure them that this won't end up as another treaty which we end up getting sucked into?
Well, we can't be sucked into this treaty because we're out of it, and we can only go into it if all 27, soon to be 28 members of the European Union agree. That is the effect of the veto.
Mr. Peter Bone.
I'm happy to report, Mr. Speaker, that Mrs. Bone was singing in the bath yesterday, with congratulating the Prime Minister for standing up for British interests and keeping us away from German economic domination of Europe. But she was concerned that it must be pretty miserable for the Prime Minister to go to Europe when his Deputy Prime Minister forced him to take with him an unelected left-wing Liberal. Would at the next conference be possible that he took a moderate constituent from my constituency with him, perhaps Mrs. Bone?
Well, I'm just relieved that my honourable friend didn't ask me what happens if I'm run over by a bus, which I gather is the question he's asked everybody else. I've been warming up for this one for some time. To be fair to the Deputy Prime Minister, I don't know whether there's room in the deposition for Mrs. Bone, and I wouldn't want to get her out of her bath.
Mr. James Morris.
Speaker, can I welcome the Council's statement on Iran? But would the Prime Minister agree with me that these sanctions that have been agreed by the EU on Iran really need to bite? Iran is kind of in the last chance saloon. What systems and processes were agreed at the European Council in relation to monitoring the implementations of those EU sanctions against Iran?
I think my honourable friend is right to raise this. Look, I think the key part of the sanctions is the oil embargo. This is a very big step for European countries to take. There is a time lag before it comes in, but I believe it comes in July. And it is a big step because there are countries like Italy and Spain and others that have been very reliant on Iranian crude in the past. So I think it's an important step. I believe actually Europe has quite a good record at making sure that sanctions it imposes are actually put in place, but I'll make sure that happens.
Mr. David Nuttall.
Mr. Speaker, my constituents warmly welcome the Prime Minister's determination to protect our interests in Europe. Can my right honourable friend explain how the United Kingdom will in practical terms actually be able to prevent those countries who sign up to the Fiscal Union Treaty from utilising the European Commission and the European Court of Justice in such a way that would damage UK interests?
I think the guarantee they won't damage UK interests is this. First of all, the treaty itself is clear that it has to be in line with the EU law. It can't override it, and it can't get into areas like the single market. I think that is one point. A second point is, as I've said in answer to questions, that if the institutions do things that are not permitted, then there can be a challenge, including a legal challenge. But above all, Britain is protected because although others are going ahead with this treaty outside the European Union, we are not part of it.
Mr. Christopher Kelly.
Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and bringing greater clarity to Britain's position, because these are complicated issues. But my constituents in Dudley South were very grateful for my right honourable friend's exercise of the veto last month. But is the ECJ, as an institution of the whole European Union, not now being unjustly used?
As I said, in pre-existing treaties, there are ways that the European institutions can be used by groups of member states. That is the fact, as our treaties, as I said, tend to be passed by the party opposite. But if they go beyond that, there are real legal issues that I've set out. And if that were to happen, then we can take action to protect our national interests.
Stephen Mosley.
Speaker, I trust my right honourable friend the Prime Minister to do what is right for Britain, but I don't necessarily trust his successors. After all, we've seen a previous government give up our hard-fought opt-out from the social chapter and give up our hard-fought budget rebate. What guarantees are there that the UK will not be sucked into this new treaty in future?
I think one of the best guarantees there are is the referendum lock that we have in place in this country, which this House of Commons passed, which the Labour Party opposed, which says that if we propose any passage of power from Westminster to Brussels, there has to be a referendum. That is absolutely key to protecting our interests and making sure that future governments can't give away powers they shouldn't.
Christopher Pincher.
Mr.
Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has made clear his determination to secure free trade agreements with, amongst others, India. But will he agree to pursue with equal vigour similar opportunities in the emerging markets in Africa?
I think my honourable friend makes a very important point. If you look at which continents are going to grow fastest over the next decade, Africa actually has got a very healthy growth rate, and countries like Nigeria and South Africa, Ghana and others will grow rapidly. We already have very low tariff access from African countries to the European Union. But I think one of the things we ought to be trying to encourage and look at is actually an pan-African free trade area, so that more of their trade can take place within Africa. They can have an effective single market as we do in the European Union.
David Rutsley.
Given the EU regulations account for 70% of the burden of the regulatory burden being faced by British businesses, can my right honourable friend tell the House what steps are being taken to exempt micro businesses from EU legislation?
My honourable friend makes a very important point, and this has been a bit of a breakthrough in Europe, which is we have been arguing for a moratorium on micro businesses, those employing less than 10 people, from new EU regulations. That has now been agreed at the EU Council, and we need to make sure it's rapidly put in place.
Sir Andrew Selous.
The Prime Minister is to be congratulated on what he and others achieved in terms of sanctions on Iran. But could he tell the House whether there have been any discussions between the European Union and Asian countries so that Iran cannot sell the oil that it's now not selling to Europe to Asia, because otherwise we'll be back in the position we were before?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this. There are two things that we need to do. First of all is to make sure that those countries that can increase production, such as Saudi Arabia, can sell more to those countries in Europe that were reliant on Iranian crude. And then we need to persuade Asian countries that might otherwise buy Iranian crude not to do the deals that they might otherwise plan. And we need to take action on both fronts.
Mr. Dan Biles.
Speaker, I strongly welcome the agreement to reduce regulatory burdens on SMEs and micro-enterprises. And while I don't expect the Prime Minister to give us a list today, can he tell the House when we can expect to see more detail on precisely which regulatory burdens small businesses in my constituency might see reduced, and when?
Well, the formal EU Council to look at the single market competitiveness and the economy is March. This was a special European Council to try and kick-start some progress on the single market, so I hope that after the March Council we'll have a very specific list for my honourable friend.
Mr. Bob Blackman.
Speaker, I welcome the commitments to bring down trade barriers and encourage trade outside the European Union from this announcement. Could my right honourable friend expand on the opportunities that will exist for British business for increased jobs, increased trade and increased commerce throughout the world?
My honourable friend, it's an important point this. If you look at what's happened with our trade with India or with China over the last couple of years, we're seeing increases of over 20%. So as we see a difficult situation in European markets, we've got to look to the faster growing markets of the world to try and grow our exports. This means great challenges for businesses. They've got to get out there and sell. It means the government's got to get behind them. But we need to help by opening up those markets, particularly things like allowing full access for services to those markets. And that's why these free trade deals are so important.
Mr. Robert Halfon.
I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Could my honourable friend set out if there are any discussions about the cost of oil and the geopolitical threats to increasing that cost? And was there any action going to be taken by the EU in order to try and reduce the cost of oil and therefore reduce prices at the pumps for motorists?
Didn't discuss the cost of oil. As I've said, there's this important issue about Saudi Arabian production, but the completion of the energy single market, because it will make the energy markets in Europe more efficient and mean that there's a proper networked grid, as it were, around Europe for energy, should help to bring energy prices down.
Mr. Alan Cairns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With more than 1 million people employed in the financial services sector across the whole of the United Kingdom, does the Prime Minister agree that many of those jobs could have been exposed to a significant degree unless he'd used his veto back in December and secured the agreement yesterday?
I think it is important to remember that the financial services industry is not just the City of London. There are 100,000 people employed in Birmingham. There are over 100,000 people employed in Scotland, and it's important we stand up for those people. Now, obviously, there are dangers still of Eurozone countries going ahead with financial transaction taxes, but I think Britain is making a strong case that actually there are ways of making sure the financial services industry pays its fair share through bank levies, through the stamp duty on share transactions, without having a financial transactions tax which would just drive activity to areas of the world that don't apply it. It doesn't work. The European Commission has said it doesn't work, and that's why we should reject it.
Order. I thank the Prime Minister and the House for their succinctness, which enabled 72 backbench members to question the Prime Minister in 66 minutes of exclusively backbench time. It shows what we can do when we put our minds to it, and I'm grateful to colleagues. I've got a suspicion that there are points of order. Thank you, Prime Minister. Point of order, Mr. Chris Bryant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You will know that the Ministerial Code of Conduct makes it clear that ministers have to provide timely answers to questions, written questions tabled by members of the House, and that this is underlined in a motion of the House. Now, I, in December of last year, tabled 3 questions to the Secretary of State for the Home Department for answer, name day answer on the 14th of December, and then another 2 on the 20th of December for answer on the 10th of January. I've still had no reply, so last week I decided that I'd table a question asking when I was going to get an answer to these questions, and I was very excited yesterday to get a reply, which said I will reply as soon as possible. Now, is there surely what the Ministerial Code means is that we must get substantive replies and not evasive replies of this, which make it look as if the question has been answered, but it hasn't actually been answered.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his point of order, and I would say 2 things in response to him. First, of course, he's right on the substantive point that the reply that is forthcoming should not only be timely, but substantive. It's not good enough for ministers to provide holding replies, particularly when they're holding replies provided very late, simply saying I'll reply as soon as possible. It must be a substantive reply. Secondly, moderately vivid imagination though I possess, a fact to which I made reference in responding to someone last week, I really cannot imagine a colleague whom it is more impolitic or foolish to fail timorously to answer than the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Rhondda, for there is no colleague more absolutely certain to make a very substantial and justified fuss about it.